Hello and welcome to this edition of Constitutionally Sound, a podcast brought to you by the Centre on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh. I'm Nicola McEwen, a Professor of Territorial Politics, and for the next half hour or so we'll be discussing the implications of the Northern Ireland Assembly election held on the 5th of May. It's too early to say whether this election marked a turning point in the history of these islands. Sinn Féin topped the poll for the first time, winning the highest share of first preference votes and the highest share of seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly. But in a system that depends upon power sharing, the party can't govern alone. Despite a disappointing election for the Democratic Unionists, the party still holds some cards in determining what happens next. So far, the DUP has refused to enter into a power-sharing executive or nominate a speaker for the Assembly until the Northern Ireland Protocol is scrapped or changed to its satisfaction. Meanwhile, the election resulted in significant gains for the Alliance Party, which is neither unionist nor nationalist. How well can a system designed to share power between two polarised communities adapt to a third force that aligns with neither? As the dust settles on the elections, I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic scholars and close observers of Northern Irish politics to explore their significance and what may come next. Katy Hayward is Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University, Belfast. She's also Senior Fellow of the UK in a Changing Europe, where I have the privilege of working alongside her. Katy is an internationally recognised expert on Brexit in Northern Ireland, particularly on the Irish border and the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol. Dr. David McCann is a political commentator, writer and university lecturer. He's Deputy Editor of Slugger O'Toole, the influential news and online platform which takes a critical look at politics in Ireland and Britain, and he's a regular media commentator. David's also lecturer in politics and government at the University of Ulster, where he holds a PhD in North-South relations. A very warm welcome to you both. Let's start with talking about the elections then. David, you observed the campaign closely and described it, I think, as a fairly low-key campaign, but the result is anything but, right? Is it what you expected? How significant is the win for Sinn Féin?
Yeah, so the campaign, I think it is worth noting that it was an unusually long campaign, because don't forget, the campaign really started when Paul Givan resigned as First Minister back in February. So in essence, we went through an incredibly long campaign. And it was incredibly interminably dull. I mean, we had to literally pick things out of thin air to actually talk about. So the result itself was actually quite seismic. So the public did a very good job of actually keeping kind of the result that they were going to produce under wraps. A couple of things that really jumped out at me was, one, the turnout was actually pretty good. In Northern Ireland, we pride ourselves the fact that we have the highest turnout of all the devolved regions, all bar one. Scotland beat us in 2016, but all bar those, we typically have decent turnouts in our elections. So we had a high turnout of around about 63%, which was very good considering the low-key campaign. And that has produced quite a significant result, as you were outlining there. So in terms of what I expected, we all knew Alliance were going to do well. And why did we know Alliance were going to do well? Because in 2019, Alliance really started breaking all sorts of records at local government level, at European level, and at the Westminster election too. And we expected that to translate through. Now, what would have taken some people by surprise was the scale of the gains. So most people were expecting Alliance on about 12, 13, 14 seats, and they ended up getting 17. So they gained in places like South Belfast, North Down, places where they weren't totally expected to win 2 seats. So that took us a bit by surprise. And the other thing that took us by surprise was also Sinn Féin. Most observers, including myself, would have said if Sinn Féin came back with 24 of the 27 seats that they went into the election with, they would be having a good day. But they re-elected everybody. All 27 Sinn Féin MLAs returned. They didn't lose a single seat, and they increased their vote share, which we certainly weren't expecting. So a very good day at the office for Sinn Féin, and a very clear margin vote share-wise over the DUP of more than 7 percentage points. A little bit closer in seats, but again, a very clear win for Sinn Féin.
Katy, what were the standout aspects of the result for you?
Obviously, Sinn Féin's success contrasts with the fortunes of the DUP. And it had already lost an MLA in the form of Alex Easton, who'd stepped down from the party amid some of the turmoil that it was experiencing over the past year. And so coming back with fewer seats, 25 seats altogether. That's obviously led to a situation in which Sinn Féin now holds the largest number of seats in the Assembly. And that's very much in the mix when it comes to the decisions that the DUP are making in light of the results and with respect to the points you mentioned at the beginning in terms of nominating a speaker for the Assembly and approving a speaker on a cross-community basis, and of course its willingness now to nominate a Deputy First Minister. So certainly the decline in fortunes of the DUP and some of the difficulties within that party and the challenges that it's been facing are very much to the fore in terms of the post-election outcome that we're having to deal with now.
One of the things that intrigues me, Katy, is the symbolism around the roles of First Minister and Deputy First Minister. And by design, we know that it's effectively one office of co-premiers and that there's equality of status between them. So why originally was the design not to have two co-leaders or co-first ministers? Why the implied hierarchy of First Minister and Deputy First Minister? And is that implied hierarchy part of what's making it difficult for the DUP to take up a deputy post?
Yes, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that the title of Deputy First Minister is one that would sit very uncomfortably with the DUP. And we know that because it was so reluctant to see a sort of a co-First Minister title when it was in the position of being First Minister. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister are effectively a joint office of equal status. I mean, one can't really make a decision without the other, but symbolically, it's very, very, very important. I thought it was interesting that Boris Johnson, in his recent piece, very long piece, over 2,000 words in the Belfast Telegraph, almost as an aside, but was saying there won't be any change to the titles of First and Deputy First Minister. He didn't sort of spell it out explicitly, but he was sort of saying, that shouldn't be a condition on the DUP coming back and being willing to nominate the Deputy First Minister. That would have been uncomfortable for the DUP. They missed the chance a few months ago when it was being proffered by Alliance in particular that perhaps that the question of the titles should be looked at again. Missed the chance to move on that. So if the DUP were to do an about turn and all sorts of things were to align and they were to be willing to nominate the Deputy First Minister to form the new executive, then yes, it looks like they would have to take on that deputy title.
David, you spoke about the success of the alliance in the election. I read a piece that you had written where you talked about Northern Ireland as a three-party state now, given the strong showing of the alliance. Can a system designed around two ethno-nationalist camps, for want of a better term, cope with a strong third force?
Well, we're about to find out because this is a bit unprecedented for Northern Ireland. We've never, just to put in context for maybe any of your listeners who aren't aware of it, I mean, Alliance have typically always kind of been what was it? David Ford, their former party leader, famously described them as the fifth party in a four-party system. So they've always been kind of a bit obscure. They've had around about 6 to 8 assembly seats over recent elections. Now they've got 17. And that is incredibly significant, and it will pose some challenges because Alliance have got big demands, around reform of the designation system, which is the basis on which our assembly votes on controversial issues. Also, how we form a government. Alliance has got big demands around reformation of the executive. So, if Alliance can keep the momentum that they have, and if they can continue to grow, you're going to see an increased amount of pressure on that. Now, Sinn Féin, it should be said, also did incredibly well. They ran on a platform of no renegotiation to the Good Friday Agreement. So there are significant buffers against Alliance's surge and Alliance's drive. And another important thing to note about Alliance's rise is that a bit of that rise was cannibalization of other kind of non-constitutional parties. So, for example, Alliance gained 2 seats at the expense of the Green Party, who, like Alliance, don't hold a position on the Constitution. So really, they dominate that other designation. There's only people before profit who've only got 1 MLA in there with them now. But the fact that we have 18 of 90 MLAs, which is 20% of the legislature, made up of that other designation, it will pose some challenges to the Unionist Nationalist consensus.
Do we know from surveys where Alliance voters are coming from? Are they distinctive in terms of demography,
Alliance were brilliant in about 10 years ago about cannibalizing liberal unionist voters. So, for example, with the Ulster Unionist Party went down, particularly in the eastern constituencies of Northern Ireland, Alliance typically went up by a corresponding amount. In this election, this was actually quite interesting, is that they were taking votes from nationalist parties. So the SDLP suffered at the hands of Alliance this time. So in places like Upper Bann and in South Down, Alliance gained seats from the SDLP. So what Alliance are doing now is they're taking soft nationalist votes into their fold, whereas before they were seen as predominantly a small U unionist party. They're doing incredibly well there as well. Also, Alliance is a bit more of a broader party. Alliance's candidates before would have been seen as much more of a unionist kind of background. I remember when Alliance's European candidate, Anna Lowe, in 2014, famously said that she would support a united Ireland, and Alliance threw Alliance into a bit of panic about that. I don't think that would be Alliance's attitude today. So they're a much more broader movement today than they would have been, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
And is that the same when it comes to things like age profile of their voters, or are they mostly older or younger?
They seem to be in mostly younger demographics. Alliance do seem to be doing well in actually getting that vote and mobilising that vote. And that tells the tale pretty much of their candidates as well. If you take a look at Alliance's assembly group, you will see quite a number of 20-somethings and 30-somethings sitting there. It's quite a young assembly group. So they've actually done quite well in actually tapping into those voters who don't have a view on the Constitution. And they're also doing a good job of being a non-threatening option for, you can still hold your view on the Union, still hold your view on a united Ireland, but because Alliance are so constitutionally agnostic, they don't really threaten you if you hold a unionist identity or if you hold a pro-Irish unification identity.
And where does the election leave the UUP and the SDLP? I mean, Colm Mease would seem to have a good campaign, but still the party had a poor result.
We have this conversation at the end of every assembly election about the UUP and the SDLP, and that is part of their problem. So in 1998, the combined UUP-SDLP vote was more than 44% of the first preference vote. In this most recent election, it was 20.3%. So that has just totally imploded since 1998. It was particularly tragic for the SDLP because you were right, Colm Mease got a lot of plaudits. We were commenting about how well the SDLP's candidates and how good they were this time. And they lost some high-profile people. Nicola McEwen, their deputy leader in North Belfast, was a huge loss for them. This was the first time ever that the SDLP has polled less than 10% at a Northern Ireland-wide election since their foundation. So it was quite devastating for them. The SDLP will now be in opposition because they don't have enough seats to qualify for the executive. So they'll have a bit of time there to potentially rebuild themselves there. The Ulster Unionists as well had a very bad election. They're at single digits in terms of assembly members. That's again a first in the history of Northern Ireland. The founding party of the state, the party of James Craig and Edward Carson, being at single digits in the Northern Ireland Parliament is quite significant too. They do have enough seats to sit in the executive, but we don't know whether they will. They did benefit from being in there with Robin Swan as the health minister. He's the most popular politician in Northern Ireland at the moment. But again, maybe for the party to rebuild, they're probably going to have to go into opposition and leave Sinn Féin, the DUP and Alliance to actually run the executive, because being in the executive essentially hasn't benefited the SDLP at all. They lost their sitting minister. And for the UUP, even though Robin Swan was incredibly popular, their vote share still did go down and they still did fall back in seats.
Okay, let's move on to thinking about the protocol. Katy, the election result has reignited debates on the future of the protocol, although those debates probably never went away. Can you give us a quick recap on where we stand with the protocol? Are the problems with its detail? Is that what unions have an issue with, or is it its implementation, or is it something more symbolic than that?
So we do polling, testing the temperature polling, it's called, for the Post-Brexit Governance NI project that my colleague David Finnemore and I run here in Queen's. And one thing that was really striking before the election was in response to our questions around priorities for different people coming into the election. And it was notable from that for DUP supporters, over 50% said that their number one priority and influence in terms of making their decision as to how they vote is the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. And a close second to that is the protocol. So a third of DUP supporters put it at their top issue, and then the remainder sort of putting it as their second top issue. So essentially, you can see here that the two issues, the constitutional future of Northern Ireland and the protocol, are completely entwined as a priority and as an issue in the minds of DUP supporters. In that way, they were very different from the rest of the electorate, with the exception of the traditional unionist voice. For other voters, including for the UUP, the health service was the top priority, closely followed by the economy, post-COVID recovery, etc. So that helps us understand why it is that the DUP really emphasised the protocol, not so much in its manifesto, which contains much of similarity to the other parties in terms of the issues touched upon, but most definitely in the rhetoric and the narratives in the election campaigning. Following on, as David mentioned, Paul Given's resignation as First Minister over the issue of the protocol. Now, of course, this has been picked up by the British government post-election result. The DUP throwing everything it can at the British government in trying to power to its elbow when it comes to negotiating with the EU and trying to push it to move on the protocol. So essentially, the DUP holding up the formation of the Assembly and Executive over the issue of the protocol has been used very much by the British government as evidence that the protocol undermines or challenges the Good Friday Agreement. It's easy amid all of this to kind of get lost from, well, what difference is the protocol making? So obviously it's a constitutional concern for unionists, particularly hardline unionists. But in reality, what are the challenges? Boris Johnson mentions quite frequently now that all the parties in Northern Ireland recognise the need to be adjustments to the protocol, and that's true, particularly if the so-called grace periods in existence at the moment end tomorrow. We really would have difficulties in implementing the protocol. But for the most part, businesses have adjusted to it, but there are some persistent difficulties. And yes, all the parties want to see adjustment to it. The question is, do they want to see that agreed with the EU, or are they prepared to see unilateral action from the British government to force the EU to move further than it has been prepared to do so to date? Interestingly enough, the Ulster Unionist Party obviously campaigned, well, not obviously, but you may be surprised to remember, campaigned for Remain in the Brexit referendum, came up fairly strongly as a pro-Leave, pro-Brexit party afterwards because the majority of its supporters voted Leave. It was really difficult to pin down prior to the election. Its manifesto is kind of hard to work out exactly what it wants in the protocol other than removal or lightening of the Irish Sea border. In recent times, Doug Beattie, the UUP leader, has said he's willing to see or prepared to see unilateral action from the British government if it forces the EU to move as necessary on the protocol. So although he disagrees with the DUP tactics, the UUP is picking up that the protocol is an issue that unionists need to double down on in order to try and get the EU to move. So it's all in the mix at the moment, and it does therefore seem really constitutionally or politically significant in a way that possibly isn't reflected in the economic realities of the protocol as it's experienced by businesses.
David, sometimes when you read some of the things that DUP representatives talk about in relation to the protocol, it's about getting rid of it or it's about changing it, and then they have 7 tests and you look through the tests and you're thinking, well, I'm not sure these are possible to satisfy. Can you imagine what would it take to change the protocol short of scrapping it to satisfy the DUP? Is there anything?
The DUP ultimately want to get as many checks taken out of the system as they can possibly get, because as you were going through with Katy there about the First Minister aspect there, the symbolism of this is what is essentially cutting through with the unionist electorate, because none of us see the border checks. Unless you're looking out at Lauren Harbour or at Belfast Port, you're not seeing these checks. You don't actually see these types of things happening. So it's the symbolism of it. So basically, you're right in outlining the parameters there. It is, how much can they get the European Commission to move to to mitigate most of this stuff. And I think something that the DUP wants is basically the goods destined for Northern Ireland only go through what is called the Greenlane, which is terminology which has been picked up by the British government, that basically there would be no checks on that. But for goods that may be going on to the Republic of Ireland and into the European single market, that those things would be checked. Now, how viable that is, how doable that is, we've been going around in circles on this for about 4 or 5 years. I know Katy has had a good diversion into some trade regulations over the past 5 years in her academic studies, and trying to work this out. So in terms of how doable this is where the contention comes into. And the other big part of the problem, Nicola, is on this in terms of how we satisfy the DUP is that, essentially they are dealing with a British government that they don't trust. And none of the other local parties here essentially trust the British government. And that is really a core part of this problem, because the DUP still feel a great sense of hurt and betrayal. The fact that the protocol was even signed up to. Don't forget, Boris Johnson a few years ago came to the DUP conference and said that no self-respecting prime minister would ever sign up to any diversions down the IRC. And of course, he duly did that when he was prime minister. So that is essentially the problem. It's one of trust. And, Katy has pointed this out all the way through in terms of the negotiations between the British government and the European Commission. Fostering that environment of trust is so key towards making progress, and is so key towards getting agreements that can last. And this whole debacle over the protocol about the UK trying to wriggle out of most of it, it hasn't exactly helped foster that type of environment.
One assumes that the threat of unilateral action doesn't exactly foster trust between the UK government and its EU partners either, Katy. What's your sense of how the EU would be likely to respond to the legislation that Liz Truss announced? I'd be interested also to hear your thoughts and learn from your expertise, Katy, on the proposals for a green lane for Northern Ireland goods. Do you think it is viable?
We haven't seen the details yet of the legislation, so I suspect that the government is still somewhat undecided as to the nature of the legislation and what exactly they're going to target. And would it be the case that they would bring something in sort of in anticipation of the legislation being passed? So perhaps trying to, enact such red and green channels for movement of goods into Northern Ireland. I mean, the difficulty there is that they would be doing it on behalf of the EU, but against the express wishes of the EU. So those channels would be in theory, to protect the integrity of the EU single market, but completely in opposition to what the EU would see as acceptable means of doing that. So this is the difficulty that we have. The requirements of the EU for protecting its single market are so much greater than what the UK is apparently now prepared to do. We should bear in mind, of course, that if you look at what the borders are like between Britain and the EU, certainly the EU's borders are much more rigorously applied, and they were much more effective in the post-Brexit border management than on the GB side. And in fact, we've seen extension after extension of the UK's bringing in of its means of managing its borders, particularly in relation to agri-food. There's a sort of sense of, yes, and in principle, the UK is saying we're not prepared to do this, but also in practice, it's less than prepared to do so as well. It's just not able for it. And the EU's conscious of that. The idea of the red and green channels won't wash with the EU straight up. That relates most particularly to customs. Like, that makes sense for customs, but when it comes to regulatory controls, even on the UK side, even Lord Frost and others who sort of support a hard Brexit approach have recognised that you still need quite rigorous checks and controls in relation to agri-food, and that the Island of Ireland is a single epidemiological unit. So that question remains the most difficult one by far. And as long as the UK government is insistent on diverging, including in GMO products, which were announced in the Queen's speech, for example, then the EU will be deeply concerned around what is coming into Northern Ireland, and therefore potentially at risk of coming into the EU as well.
How likely is it then, do you think, that the issues around the protocol and whatever action the UK government decides to take on that will have wider repercussions for the trade and cooperation agreement, the wider agreement between the UK and the EU?
I mean, already we've seen the issue of the protocol connected to the rollout of the TCA and the UK-EU relationship. So the expansion of the Horizon Research Programme, for example, the EU has not been prepared to move on a lot of that because of the concerns around the protocol, and it's becoming increasingly explicit in saying, as long as you're not moving properly and fulfilling your obligations in the withdrawal agreement, we're not going to see the complete fulfillment of the TCA and all the potential within that. So it definitely sees a connection there. And one of the reasons why the European Parliament, for example, was quite keen to pass the TCA was that it thought in so doing, it would strengthen the arm of the EU in terms of being able to retaliate, for want of a better word, if the UK was not fulfilling its obligations with respect to the protocol. I mean, in theory, if we see a serious and substantial breach of the rule of law from the UK, then the EU has the capacity to suspend or even terminate the TCA. This, of course, would hurt itself as well as the UK. I think it's much more likely to see, it needs to take a proportionate approach, and we're much more likely to see other means by which the EU can express its dissatisfaction, for want of a better word, with the UK's approach, for example, in rigorously implementing checks and controls on British goods entering the EU, and thereby have an impact on Britain, rather than allowing the disruptive effects around unilateral action on the protocol to have a particularly negative effect on the island of Ireland.
Okay, let's finally then just turn back to Northern Ireland and thinking about the outcome of the elections and the likelihood of an administration. How likely, David, do you think it is that a stable administration can be formed, or should we expect fresh elections within the year?
I think in terms of actually getting a stable administration, I would be hopeful we will get something back this year. Of course, because we're so desperately cynical here in Northern Ireland, of course, the minute we get an administration back, we restart our countdown clocks before it collapses again. But I think that we should be able to get something back this year. There is the potential and there is rumor that maybe from a DP perspective, it would be good to have another election in October or November this year. But again, I'm not sure what that solves, because that is just inherent with risks for the DUP. You know, that the DUP could potentially fall back, maybe another seat or two, maybe Alliance could pick up some steam. You know, there's no guarantee that Sinn Féin would fall back if there was another election. So, you know, I would be hopeful that we'll get an executive back. But in terms of another election, let's just wait and see. I doubt a winter election will be too popular with many people.
Does the election result have any bearing on debates and prospects for Irish unity? I mean, I know Sinn Féin played down the unity question in the campaign, but it's still central to their ambitions.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Now, the interesting thing was that the nationalist designation and the unionist designation in the Assembly are smaller now than they were before the election because of the rise of the Alliance Party. So Sinn Féin still have work to do in terms of actually reaching out to the Alliance Party. In fact, so does unionism. And that's something that this election has crystallized. It's crystallized something that people like me have been banging on about for the last 3 or 4 years, is that, look, if you want a border poll or you want to secure the union, the essential path to both of those, it doesn't run through a poll. It doesn't really run through Brandon Lewis. It runs through one woman, and that's Naomi Long. So she will decide. She and her voters will decide whether a border poll happens in the main, number one, and two, decides who gets a 5 in front of their end number in an eventual referendum. So Naomi Long and her voters will decide, does unionism have a 5 in front of it at the end result of a referendum, or does the pro-unification cause have a 5 in front of it? It's that dynamic.
I mean, that's really interesting, but is she likely to come out in favour of one side or another?
Well, she has said that Alliance would take a position on a border poll, but I would struggle to see how they do that, because, again, there are a lot of people in the Alliance Party who would privately be in favour of Irish unification. Interestingly enough, their deputy leader, Stephen Farry, is engaging with that conversation. He's taken part in events held by groups such as Ireland's Future, which is a pro-unification group. You know, Stephen Farry comes along and gives the Alliance Party point of view on that, and they do engage with the conversation about the future of Northern Ireland whilst not declaring a position themselves. So for Alliance, I think very much the priority right now is getting the executive reformed and dealing with the cost of living crisis. It's not their raison d'etre. It's not what they're all about. But I think quite significantly in a Brexit environment, they aren't shying away from that conversation. They're not shying away from debates about the future of the island of Ireland.
We often talk in contrast to Scotland that there is a path towards a unity referendum in Northern Ireland, and as set out in the Good Friday Agreement, but it's ambiguous, isn't it, Katy? I mean, what would you expect to be the conditions under which the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland would be obliged to facilitate a border poll?
He's refused to say so far what he would judge to be indicative of there being a majority in favour of Irish unification, which would what they'd have, you'd have to see that as being in existence in order to be, to call such a referendum. Refused to do it under the conditions of the Northern Ireland Act. So there are various things there. I mean, you could have a vote in the Assembly. There's a prospect of that, I guess. Or there could be, you could judge it by first preference votes for nationalist parties, or by seats held, or by opinion polling. And if I may, can I make a wee plug for the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey? So we're publishing our latest results from that on Thursday, the 26th of May, together with John Curtis and UK Changing Europe. So that will present the latest findings in terms of attitudes in Northern Ireland towards the Good Friday Agreement and reform of it, and also on the constitutional question. And one thing that we've been tracking through the longitudinal aspects of the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey since Brexit has been the rise in expectation of Irish unification. And interestingly, just to go back to your question on Alliance Party supporters, just quite how much there's been a shift towards those who are non-aligned being in favour of Irish unity, very much linked to obviously the Remain vote as well. So I can't give anything away other than to say the trends are really interesting, and that the unionists as well as nationalists might be interested in seeing the sort of the direction of travel. And I think all of that helps us understand, to go back to the beginning, if you like, why it is that this particular moment seems so important for Northern Ireland, and why it is that, particularly for unionists, the linking in of Brexit and the protocol with Northern Ireland's constitutional future is such a pertinent issue at the moment. And similarly, of course, for nationalists, why Brexit really has changed the landscape and highlighted the importance of the decisions being made now with respect to the functioning of the Assembly and potential dynamics within public opinion around Northern Ireland's future.
We'll really look forward to seeing those results in more detail. Katy, David, thank you very much for joining us today and guiding us through all of these complexities and fascinations of Northern Ireland politics. I learned a ton. I hope our listeners have as well. And thanks to all of you for tuning in to today's episode. You've been listening to Constitutionally Sound from the Centre on Constitutional Change with me, Nicola McEwen, Professor Katy Hayward of Queen's University Belfast, and Dr. David McCann of Ulster University and Deputy Editor of Slugger O'Toole. Speak to you next time. Thank you.